Pop quiz. What do bobbing for apples, trick-or-treating, carving pumpkins, and decorating with black and orange all have in common apart from being staples of the ostensibly secular October 31st celebration of Halloween? Turns out all of these customs are rooted in the much older Celtic festival of Samhain. Yes, the reason why once a year, just after sunset, suburban streets bustle with the boisterous baying of becostumed boys and girls is because, well, consumerism? Sure. And because kids love candy? Absolutely. And because, let's face it, dressing up in costumes and lunging at floating or dangling apples and plunging steely knives into unsuspecting gourds is silly and fun. But the reason we do all of these things together as part of a grand spectacle wrapped in black and orange is because the ancient Goidelic, a.k.a. Gaelic-speaking Celts, and potentially other Celtic tribes as well, we'll get into it, notoriously spent the evening of October 31st both feasting and defending against nocturnal ne'er-do-wells. See, Samhain was the Celtic New Year, marking the end of one pastoral year and the beginning of the next. The occasion was marked by the lighting of druidic bonfires, their bright orange flames standing out in stark contrast to the encroaching blackness of winter. Hollowed-out vegetable lanterns were employed to transport coals from these sacred fires so people could ceremonially relight their hearth fires at home, and apples were strung from tree branches as offerings to the gods. Offerings meant to ensure the eventual return of the sun's dominance over darkness. To the Celts, Samhain was a liminal time, a time when the veil between this world and the other world was at its thinnest, and all manner of spirits and demons and fairies were wont to cross over. Disguises were donned in an effort to blend in with or scare away the things going bump in the night, and sweet treats were left out in an effort to appease these beastly beings. But in the absence of actual monsters, some enterprising human souls began going door to door every Samhain to collect the aforementioned treats. And naturally, whenever these opportunistic revelers visited a home that did not put out treats, they vandalized it, or played some kind of trick. So there you have it, the Celtic origins of all your favorite Halloween traditions. Or the abridged version anyway, because in the rest of this video, I'm going to unpack all of the customs I just mentioned one by one. But before I do that, I'm going to take a big step back and provide you with a more in-depth definition of Samhain and go over its etymology and history. But truth be told, before I do any of those things, I'm gonna plug my book real quick. It's called Samhain in Your Pocket, a tiny little book about the Celtic origins of Halloween. Everything in this video is also in there, along with so much more, and you can literally fit it in your pocket. It's the perfect primer for impressing your friends with frightening factoids at your next All Hallows Eve gathering. Now, on with the show. What is Samhain? Definition and etymology. Falling at the midway point between the autumnal equinox and the winter solstice, Samhain is one of, and arguably the most important of, the four so-called Celtic cross-quarter days, the other three being Imbolc, Beltane, and Lunasa. Looking at a modern calendar, we'd say the Feast na Samhain, or Festival of Samhain, begins on the evening of October 31st and stretches into the morning of November 1st. And that's because the ancient Celts measured their days sunset to sunset, not midnight to midnight. The festival is infamous for its associations with death and evil and fire, and according to author and librarian Ruth Edna Kelly's The Book of Halloween, said associations have everything to do with the changing of the seasons, and more specifically, the suffering of the sun. And I quote, "On November 1st was Samhain, summer's end. The year was over, and the sun's life of a year was done. The Celts thought that at this time, the sun fell victim for 6 months to the powers of winter darkness. From the idea that the sun suffered from his enemies on this day grew the association of Samhain with death." End quote. Author Clement A. Miles reiterates Kelly's summer's end etymology of Samhain in his book Christmas in Ritual and Tradition, Christian and Pagan, while also offering an alternative, assembly. If accurate, the assembly interpretation may harken back to Samhain's origins as a harvest or pastoral festival. Rather than being a morbid affair, perhaps those first Samhains were about people coming together and sharing their recently harvested crops and celebrating the return of their livestock, which would have just completed their forced migration down from summer highland pastures to winter lowlands, a process known as transhumance. There is one final etymological interpretation of Samhain that bears mentioning, courtesy of PronounceItRight.com, which, yes, was a resource I used for my How to Pronounce Samhain video. The website makes clear that the, quote, origin of the word Samhain is not entirely known, end quote, which I think is a statement we can all get behind, before presenting the following hypothesis. Samhain is derived from the union of the words Sam, meaning summer, and Fun, meaning fun. This one seems hard to swallow. Based on my cursory understanding of European weather patterns, there is no summer fun to be had in late October in Ireland or anywhere in northwestern Europe for that matter. Which actually leads me to my next point, a brief history of Samhain. While the term Samhain is used primarily to describe the frightening and fire-filled pastoral festival as it was celebrated in pre-Christian Ireland, the roots of said festival potentially date back not only to much earlier, but also back to the European continent. According to researcher Joseph Monar, archaeological evidence, including the Coligny calendar, which was dated to the 2nd century CE, suggests that the Celts of ancient Gaul celebrated their new year at the end of summer. Indeed, the first month of the Gaulish New Year was called Samonios in the Gaelic language, derived from the root samo, meaning summer, leading some scholars to believe that the Irish Samhain is rooted in the same tradition. It's also telling that just about every region settled by, or at least heavily influenced by, the Celts would come to celebrate a version of what appears to be the same holiday on October 31st/November 1st. Starting with the Goidelic or Gaelic-speaking Celtic countries, we of course have Samhain in Ireland, but also Samhain in Scotland and Hop tu Na in the Isle of Man, though the proper Manx term for the festival is Wee Honey, which may correspond to the Irish Oicha Samhain or Oicha Shamna, meaning the night preceding Samhain, according to scholar and folklore researcher J.A. McCulloch's The Religion of the Ancient Celts. Now, amongst the Brythonic or Brittonic-speaking Celtic countries, the October 31st/November 1st festival is referred to not as summer's end, but as the calends of winter, calends being a fancy word for the first day of. Thus, in Wales, the Samhain equivalent festival is Calan Gaeth, in Cornwall it's Calan Gaeaf, and in Brittany it's Calan Gaeaf. Semantics aside, summer's end, winter's beginning, it meant the same thing to the ancient Celts who only observed the two seasons, winter and summer. The Britons celebrated their October 31st/November 1st festivals much in the same manner as the Gaels. Death was the central theme, ceremonial fires were lit to guard against the coming darkness of winter, tasty treats and adult beverages were consumed. We find traces of this same Celtic tradition in Portugal, Galicia, Asturias, Cantabria, Catalonia, and other regions of the Iberian Peninsula, which is especially interesting because according to Irish mythology, the Gaels, aka the Milesians, are said to have invaded Ireland by way of Spain. The Celtiberian Samhain, known as Castañada or Magosto, depending on the region, is best known today as a chestnut roasting festival. And yes, you better believe those chestnuts are roasted over an open fire. The ubiquity of Samhain and its equivalents in Atlantic Europe no doubt caught the attention of the Catholic Church. So much so that in 835 CE, Pope Gregory III decided to reschedule a Christian holiday, All Saints' Day, so that it coincided with Samhain. Up until that point, All Saints' Day, known variously as All Hallows' Day, Hallow Mass, Feast of All Saints, Feast of All Hallows, and Solemnity of All Saints, was held in May. First celebrated in 609 CE, it was originally intended to honor the Virgin Mary and Christian martyrs, but when Pope Gregory III changed the date to November 1st, he also expanded the holiday to include the commemoration of All Saints. This was likely an attempt by the Church to harness and redirect some of that thinking about dead people energy Samhain had already generated. More on that later. Now, it's easy to look back and say that Christianization was effective. After all Hallows Eve, or Halloween, is now the dominant October 31st holiday in the Western world, not Samhain. But upon further reflection, Halloween has become so secularized as to have lost most of, if not all of, its Christian underpinnings. And as you're about to discover, what we've been left with, modern Halloween, is really a collection of ancient Celtic customs that have morphed and evolved over the years, but that still retain their Samhain DNA. Let's explore some of them. Why do we bob for apples on Halloween? Nothing says Halloween fun quite like plunging your face into a bucket of water in the hopes of getting an apple wedged between your teeth like you're some kind of prized pig preparing yourself for a roast. I mean, seriously, where the heck did this bizarre semi-aquatic autumnal custom come from? Go back a couple of centuries and you might have witnessed courtly lords and ladies bobbing for apples in an effort to foretell their romantic futures. In Britain, a common version of the game was to have each floating apple correspond to a potential mate. Young women would take turns aiming their chompers at the apples named for the young men they fancied. Get the apple on the first try and the relationship was bound to blossom. Get it on the second try and sparks would fly at first, but then the relationship would fizzle. Get it on the third try and the poor young lady might as well spit it out. The relationship just wasn't meant to be. In Ireland, a variation of apple bobbing called snap apple is the more common form of fruit-based merrymaking. This version of the game sees players lunging teeth first at apples suspended from strings rather than having them thrashing around in buckets of water. In his 18th century work, Collectane de Rebus Copernicus, British military surveyor Charles Vallancey, who was stationed in Ireland, described snapapple, noting that young unmarried people would compete to determine who would be the next to marry. The first to sink their teeth into a dangling apple would be walking down the aisle in no time. Clearly, bobbing for apples and snapapple were once courtship rituals, games for divining the future romantic entanglements of the players. But what does that have to do with Halloween or its predecessor Samhain? As journalist Alison Richards wrote for NPR, quote, "The specific connection between apples, fortune-telling, and Halloween goes back to the Celtic festival Samhain. It fell around the end of our modern October and marked the end of summer, the end of harvest, and, revelers worried, perhaps the extinction of life itself. To encourage the sun deity to return the following year, ancient Celts burned huge bonfires into the night and tied apples to evergreen branches. According to this tradition, barriers to the underworld were temporarily suspended. It was a time when divination was supposedly especially powerful." End quote. So there you have it. Apples hanging from tree branches, fortune-telling abilities believed to be at full strength. The ingredients were there for a tradition like apple bobbing to develop. But enough about apples. Everyone knows the real symbol of Halloween is the pumpkin, right? Why do we carve pumpkins on Halloween? A quick note, I've already explored this subject in depth in my video on the Irish origins of the jack-o'-lantern, so I'm going to keep this section short and sweet, like a little pumpkin pie or a pumpkin tartlet or something. Anyway, long before anyone was carving pumpkins on Halloween, the ancient Irish were carving faces into turnips and beets and sticking coals or candles inside of them to create lanterns. According to Irish folklore, this was done to commemorate the suffering of Stingy Jack, a bastard of a blacksmith who tricked the devil and, as a result, was cursed to wander the bogs for all eternity with only a carved turnip lantern to light his way. That's the origin of the name jack-o'-lantern, Jack of the Lantern, although the term was originally used to describe the phenomenon of ignis fatuus, a.k.a. will-o'-the-wisps, a.k.a. fairy lights, a.k.a. fool's fire, wherein gases released by decomposing organic matter combust above peat bogs. But enough about flaming bog farts. Here's how jack-o'-lanterns became associated with Halloween. On Samhain, fires were supposed to be extinguished and rekindled from ceremonial fires lit by druids. To facilitate the transfer of this fire, coals were placed into lanterns made from root vegetables. Remember, Samhain marked the end of the harvest season, so there were plenty of root vegetables to go around. As Nathan Mannion, senior curator of Dublin's Irish Emigration Museum, told National Geographic, quote, "Metal lanterns were quite expensive, so people would hollow out root vegetables. Over time, people started to carve faces in designs to allow light to shine through the holes without extinguishing the ember." End quote. The carved faces also served another purpose, to scare away any vengeful spirits, demons, fairies, etc. that happened to cross over from the Celtic otherworld during Samhain, as the evening of October 31st was believed to be a time when the barriers between the land of the living and the land of the dead became permeable. Flash forward to the 19th century, and millions of Irish immigrants bring their tradition of carving root vegetables on Halloween with them to North America. Only when they get here, they discover a rotund native vegetable that is much better suited to the art form, the pumpkin. The rest, as they say, is Halloween history. Why do we decorate with black and orange on Halloween? In order to understand why black and orange became the colors of Halloween, we once again need to look back to Halloween's Celtic progenitor, Samhain. Let's tackle black first. Turns out black wasn't associated with Samhain because it's the color of spookiness, but because it's the color of death and mourning. And what is Samhain if not a celebration of death? The festival is centered around the dead who have passed on to the Celtic otherworld but who might make an appearance on the evening of October 31st, as well as the figurative death of the sun as winter approaches. As Whiskey Stevens, author of the book Rise of the Witch, told Reader's Digest, quote, "Black is a representation of the dark months that come with winter." End quote. So what about orange? It's gotta be the pumpkins, right? Making jack-o'-lanterns, after all, has been a Samhain tradition for centuries. But remember, Celtic peoples originally used root vegetables for making jack-o'-lanterns. Pumpkin carving came later, and by then orange had already been well established as a color of Halloween. What gives? Here's a clue. Go rub 2 sticks together. Bonus points if those sticks have a few fall leaves attached to them. Allow me to be less cryptic. It's likely that orange represents the ceremonial Samhain fires lit by druids on the evening of October 31st. Of course, there's also the prevalence of the color orange in autumn leaves, which may have reinforced the idea of orange being a Samhain color. To quote Stevens, "Orange is representative of the fire that burns during the festival of Samhain and during the winter months. It also corresponds to the leaves that have changed color in the harvest itself." End quote. Why do we wear costumes on Halloween? Some of you may find this hard to believe, but there was a time, many moons ago, when children dressed up on Halloween not as Marvel superheroes or Disney princesses, but as ghosts and goblins and all manner of ghoulish, ghastly, terrifying demons. Shocking, I know. But this is pretty much how the Samhain tradition of wearing costumes originated. The goal wasn't to appear cute or strong or extravagant, it was to disguise oneself from, or even blend in with, the ghosts and goblins that might potentially be crossing over from the otherworld. That meant adopting a frightening appearance. Starting in the 16th century, if not earlier, groups known as mummers or geysers would pay homage to this Celtic custom by gallivanting around in costumes on Halloween. Here's how author and folklorist Florence Marion McNeill explained guising and its origin in her book The Silver Bough, Volume 3, A Calendar of Scottish National Festivals, Halloween to Yule. Note, this same passage also appears in her later book Halloween, Its Origin, Rites, and Ceremonies in the Scottish Tradition. Quote, "There is nothing even nominally Christian about the Halloween geysers. It is thought that they may have originated in a folk memory of the actual initiators at the Druidic feast who, as masked men, represented spirits, but until fairly recent times their object was to avoid being recognized by the spirits of their dead who might possibly do them a mischief. Today, the grotesque masks and fantastic garments of the geysers represent the uncanny creatures whom their forefathers believed to be at large on this occult night. Ghoulies, ghasties, and bogies, fairies, banshees, and gruagogs, witches, warlocks, and warwickos, brownies, urisks, and shellycoats, kelpies and waterbulls, spunkies, gnomes, trolls, and sprites, the whole unhallowed clan jamfrey of the netherworld." End quote. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate McNeill's use of the word clan jamfrey, which is officially my new favorite word of all time. It might also be interesting to learn that in addition to the wearing of grotesque masks and fantastic garments on Halloween, face painting appears to have its origin in Samhain as well, and it's directly connected to those ceremonial bonfires we've heard so much about in previous sections. To quote McNeill, "Instead of masks, some of the geysers have blackened faces. This is a relic of the blackening with the ashes of the druidical bonfires for protection and good fortune." End quote. Why do we give out candy on Halloween? As we learned earlier from journalist Alison Richards, ancient Celts tied apples to evergreen branches on Samhain to encourage the return of their sun deity. Richards goes on to tell us that in the same vein, quote, "gifts of fruit and nuts and animal sacrifices were offered to the gods." End quote. Anthropologist Walter Evans Wentz bolsters this claim in his book The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, noting, quote, "Samhain was the great Celtic feast of the dead when offerings or sacrifice of various kinds were made to ancestral spirits and to the Tuatha Dé Danann and the spirit hosts under their control." End quote. For those unfamiliar with the Tuatha Dé Danann, they are the old gods of Irish mythology, known for their, quote, "supremacy over ghosts and demons on Samhain and their power to steal mortals away at such a time." End quote. So yeah, it was important to make offerings to these guys and gals, lest they unleash a fire-breathing, enchanted, timpan-playing monster from the otherworld on your ass, which is exactly what happens in the story of Elaine. To quote Evan Wentz, "Elaine visits Tara, the old psychic center both for Ireland's high kings and its druids. He comes, as it were, against the conquerors of his race, who, in their neglectfulness, no longer render due worship and sacrifice on the feast of Samhain to the Tuatha Dé Danann, the gods of the dead, at that time supreme. And then it is that he works his magic against the royal palaces of the kings and druids on the ancient hill." End quote. After being conquered by the invading Milesians and driven underground, or so the story goes, the Tuatha Dé Danann grew smaller in popular imaginations, both literally and figuratively. The powerful gods of old became the a.k.a, the people of the hills, otherwise known as fairies. But their connection to Samhain and their perceived potential for mischief-making remained strong. Thus, later generations of Celtic peoples began leaving sweet treats out on their doorsteps on the evening of October 31st to appease the fairies and whatever demons and restless spirits might be in their company. Even after Samhain was nominally Christianized, people continued this tradition, albeit with a more personal twist. It became less about appeasing sinister fairies and spirits, and more about accommodating the homesick souls of loved ones who'd passed on. As McNeill explains, quote, "All over Europe, the souls of the departed were believed to revisit their old homes on the eve of All Hallows and warm themselves at the fire or regale themselves with the food and drink set out for them by their kinsfolk." End quote. Eventually, people began leaving out a specific type of sweet treat for the souls that visited on All Hallows Eve, soul cakes. Made with raisins, cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg, the soul cake was the forerunner to Halloween candy. Why do we go trick-or-treating on Halloween? So, to recap the previous two sections, we've got people going about in costume on All Hallows Eve to disguise themselves from spirits, and we've got people leaving sweet treats out on their front stoops on that same night to appease those same spirits. Clearly, the conditions were perfect for a new All Hallows Eve tradition to develop. burning witches. Nope, wait, trick-or-treating. I meant trick-or-treating. This tradition likely got its start when villagers and townsfolk dressed as ghosts and fairies and demons and the like began accepting, re-stealing Samhain offerings on behalf of those otherworldly beings they were impersonating. Upon arriving at homes that didn't have any sweet treats on offer, the disguised Samhain revelers perpetrated acts of mischief in recompense. As a result, people eventually began giving out sweet treats on the evening of October 31st to appease not the spirits, but their costumed impersonators. This is the foundation upon which modern trick-or-treating is built. To quote husband and wife authors Vince and Sandra Peddle, who write under the pen name SV Peddle, today's popular Halloween costume of trick-or-treat, although believed to be an American import, can be traced to these ancient European customs of appeasing the dead. The children who call on households on Halloween night with the choice between good and bad luck, trick-or-treat, give me a sweet or I'll do something nasty to you, personify the old spirits of the winter, who demanded reward in exchange for good fortune. End quote. And that comes from the book Pagan Channel Islands, Europe's Hidden Heritage. Of course, there would be several steps in the development of trick-or-treating. It didn't jump directly from rabble-rousers impersonating spirits to children roaming neighborhoods collecting candy. In one of its medieval iterations, known as souling, poor people would go to wealthy homes on All Hallows Eve and say prayers for the souls of deceased loved ones and or give performances in exchange for money and food. By the 19th century, it was common for households to give out nuts and fruits, apples in particular, to costumed children on Halloween. And by the 1920s, candy had entered the mix. The age of modern trick-or-treating, and some might say the age of modern Halloween, had arrived. If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment and basically tap all of the little buttons, and by the end of it make sure you are subscribed to the Irish Myths channel. That really helps. And if you want to learn more about ancient Celtic festivals, this video is actually the fourth in a quadrilogy on the Celtic cross-border days. My videos on Imbolc, Beltane, and Lunasa are linked below. Once again, I have a book, Samhain, in your pocket. Oh, and I have another book, Irish Monsters, in your pocket. So if you want to learn about the darker side of Irish mythology, go ahead and grab yourself a copy. My name is I.E. Neverday, editor of the short story collection Neon Druid and creator of IrishMyths.com. Thanks for coming out.